Our guest today is Leszek Balcerowicz, the former chairman of the National Bank of Poland, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Poland. He is an economist and today professor at the Warsaw School of Economics. He is famous for implementing the shock therapy program in Poland that moved that country from the centrally planned Soviet economy into the free market capitalist economy it is today. Professor Balcerowicz, welcome and thank you for taking the time for speaking with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
In the early 1990s, it must have been apparent at that time that Poland was going to shift from a centrally planned economy to a free market capitalist economy. What was going through your mind at that time, and how does one approach such a significant shift in the economic landscape of a country?
Well, it was not clear in the 80s that Poland will be free in the near future. Even in 1989, in the spring, most of the people thought that the Soviet Union would still exist, and as a result, Poland could not be free. So it came as a big surprise in the middle, in June 1989, that after almost 3 elections, the first non-communist government after the Second World War was originated, and then there came the question, what about economic changes? It was clear that once we are free, we can and should abandon socialism, but this realization came under very difficult economic conditions. So there were not many people who were ready to take responsibility for the transformation and stabilization of Poland's economy. I had a hobby during previous years. I was interested in reforms, and even in the second half of the 1970s, I created an informal group of then young economists to work on this topic. Well, in the first phase, we assumed that unfortunately, it is not very likely that Soviet Union would disappear, so we have to limit our ambitions, and we are working on the project, which was mostly based on labor management firms like in Yugoslavia, because privatization seemed to be out of question for geopolitical reasons. And when first Solidarity came into being in Poland in August 1980, there was a great demand for the proposals for reform, and turned out that we were the only group which has been working systematically for over 2 years. So I sat down, and as a leader of the group, I wrote a report which became very popular with the Solidarity, and the economic program of first Solidarity was largely based on this reform. However, Solidarity, as we know, was suppressed by the introduction of the martial law in Poland in December 1981. And the group continued the work, but we did not bother anymore about being realistic or not. So we focused on such issues like privatization, deregulation, stabilization, without, however, dreaming that our work could be of any practical use. But it turned out that we are the only group in Poland in 1989 when there was a search for people who would take responsibility for Poland's reforms. So we are the only group. We did some systematic work. So I was asked by then Prime Minister Mazowiecki to be the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance. I kindly refused first. He asked me to reconsider. My wife was strongly against, very strongly against my acceptance. I don't know, but I said yes. So it started. But let me say that without this homework which we did with the group, and without having a group of people who work with me during the past year, I would never agreed, because the task was rather dramatic.
The reforms seem to have served Poland very well over the last 20 years. Is that something you would agree with?
To assess anything, you have to compare. So you compare Poland with other countries of the region, and then you see that Poland has achieved the largest increase in GDP compared to all other countries like Czech Republic, Slovakia, even the Baltics, Bulgaria, Romania. So I think this is an evidence that Poland's transformation was good for the Polish people. But we should remember not everything was done. We still have much to do in order to strengthen Poland's economic growth and catching up of Poland with richer countries, especially Germany. Our ambition should not be just the leader in the region. Our ambition should be to grow faster than already rich country of Western Europe, especially of Germany, and to narrow the gap in per capita income, which is possible with good policies. And good policies never fall like manna from heaven. You have to fight for good policy in a peaceful way in democracy, because there are many people who would like the state to expand, to increase spending, which means that taxes have to increase, so public debt would increase. There are people who are pressing for more regulations, for good or bad reasons. And if they prevail, then the whole society pays the price. So they should not be allowed to prevail. And this calls for professional organizations and opinion leaders who would point out to society what would be the price for state expansion. And then the most dramatic price is Greece. It's becoming like Greece. Systematic overspending, especially social spending, which ends in the catastrophe.
Poland's economy resisted the 2008 credit crisis and was the only EU country that did not shrink at that time. For the year 2011, Poland posted a growth rate of 4.3%, and in 2012 is expected to grow at the fastest rate within the EU at a rate of 2.5%. Now, what is it about Poland's economy that makes it appear so bulletproof to all sorts of negative news?
No country is bulletproof forever. So, and the fact that there will be reasonable growth relative to other countries is not a guarantee that it will continue. You have all the time to watch whether problems are not growing. You have to see what are the weaknesses and work to remove the problems and the weaknesses. Now, in Poland, we have certain weaknesses besides our successes. There are certain weaknesses to be removed. First, we also will suffer because of aging. And if nothing is done, then the number of employed people would slowly decline over time. So less people would work. And this is not good for economic growth, which always is indispensable for the improvement in the standard of living of millions of people. So we have to postpone, to retire later. Like it was just announced in Canada, that Canada is going to shift to 67, to the retirement age of 67. In Poland we needed to, and I think it should be done faster than the government has just announced. Not 40 years for women, but 20. So employment, we have to avoid the situation and less people work. Because then we would suffer a slowdown and we would probably have to increase taxes, which are bad for economic growth. Second, we should invest more as a ratio of GDP, because investment is important also for innovations. Many innovations require new equipment. And to increase investment, we should not only rely on foreign capital, which of course is useful, but we should increase savings in Poland, the ratio of savings to GDP, which requires also some good policies. And finally, we've been quite successful with productivity growth. Poland's economy produces completely new products and better products than those which were produced 25 years ago, and production processes are much more efficient. And this was largely due to huge technology transfer from abroad, which is normal for catching up countries. But with the passage of time, our productivity growth would depend more and more on universities. And universities should be more reformed than it was the case so far. The links between universities and the economy, industry, manufacturing, and other sectors of the economy are very weak. So, while being very happy that we achieved so much in Poland during the last 21 or 2 years, we should always focus on the future. And a good future requires constant productive efforts. So as the framework for work, entrepreneurship, innovations is better and better and does not worsen.
Between 2001 and 2003, Greece engaged in a foreign currency swap that essentially saw 2.8 billion euros vanish. This gave the impression that Greece was falling in line with the Maastricht Treaty rules. Now, this move would eventually cost Greece 5.8 billion euros, but this is just one piece of a larger puzzle in the debt that Greece has accumulated today. So, who failed in this disastrous Greek scenario we have today? Was it the Greeks themselves? Was it the EU institutions that were responsible for overseeing these types of issues? Or was the Eurozone simply flawed from the very beginning?
While speaking about Eurozone, one should remember that besides Greece or Portugal, you have very healthy economies like Germany or Austria, Finland, Netherlands. So one should not generalize from the worst case, because the general picture would be biased. This is not to say that there are no serious problems in Greece, there were. And the reason for the present problem in Greece was a systematic overspending. They were spending too much. And this was a spending which expanded public administration and social transfers. Greek politicians pretended to be Santa Clauses. They pretended that they make promises, and voters were supporting them. So voters allow themselves to be cheated. So who is to be blamed? In democracy, if you choose bad politicians in expectation that they would bring you something, you are ultimately responsible for that. Whom should they shift responsibility? Of course, one can add that European institutions should be much more vigilant, that they should discover earlier the fact that the budgetary statistics in Greece were not very reliable, to say the least. But I would repeat, if you are a democratic country, if you are a free country, you are responsible for what's going on in your country. Now, Greece has achieved massive assistance, also in the form of deep debt reduction. From economic point of view, there are ample possibilities to improve the economy, because there are so many distortions. So you remove distortions with reforms. So if they only mobilize, if there is only sufficient political mobilization, I think Greece can overcome its problem. It's up to the Greeks, ultimately, to do it. The question is whether the fact that some countries in the Eurozone, like Greece, but also Portugal, to some extent Spain, Italy, whether this fact is to some extent connected with their membership in the Eurozone. Probably yes, in a sense that these countries have obtained, upon entry into the Eurozone, obtained a sort of windfall gains. They used to pay much higher yields or interest rates for the debt, and these interest rates have dropped. And instead of using this to reduce the debt, they misuse it because they increase the spending. So this was this dangerous part. There was a temptation. They could not resist. And temptations are very dangerous, both for individuals and societies. So this is the link, but countries which have strong institutions, like the one which I mentioned, Germany, Austria, Finland, they largely resisted this temptation. Their windfall gains also were much smaller. So the conclusion I think one can make from the experience of the Eurozone is that if you are disciplined fiscally, and if your economy is flexible, you can achieve net benefits. So benefits may be larger than cost. And this is the case, I think, of Germany and these other so-called Nordic countries. If you enter the Eurozone while not being disciplined, if you misuse the membership by expanding spending, and your economy is not flexible, then most likely the cost would be larger than the benefits.
In the early 1990s, you were busy extracting the state from the economy in Poland. Today, it appears that the EU is injecting itself more and more into the economies of the Eurozone. Now, is that a fair assumption, and what does that mean for the future of the EU?
Well, socialism was a total politicization of society and the economy, and this is why it failed so miserably. There was market, it was against the market, private ownership, a lot of budgetary spending, and the main direction of the reform, if it were to be successful, must have been less state, but better state. For example, better justice system, which we still have to work on. This is not a finished job, but much more scope for private activity, individual activity, both for-profit and non-for-profit enterprises, but also NGOs. And building a good framework for productive activity of the individuals. That's the main direction. And thanks to that, we have achieved these successes like economic growth, vibrant civil society. However, the job is not finished. We still have very rather high spending to GDP ratio, almost like in Germany. Our budget deficit is 5% of GDP, which is way too high, and we should reduce it not via increasing taxes, but rather thanks to reforms on the spending side, because it's much better. The second strategy is much better for economic growth. As I mentioned, we have to still much to do in the justice system. Our courts are too slow, prosecutors are too slow and not always just. So we have to work still on the better state, smaller but better. In the Eurozone, those countries which expanded the state intervention, fiscal or regulatory, they are paying the price. Those countries which reformed are in a better shape. Germany is praised as the strongest country in the Eurozone. But why? Because Germans did lots of reform under the previous coalition. They removed the most flagrant rigidities of the labor market. They started to reduce the budget deficit. So the lesson is very clear. If you want to be a success, work so that the framework for individuals' productive activity is better and better, which means that the state should be smaller, but should be focused on those things which private markets cannot deliver at all or cannot deliver fully. And this is the justice system. What else? National defense. They are the main areas when the state is necessary. Some elementary social safety net, but elementary, and not such that many people would choose social transfer instead of working, like it is the case in many countries and to some extent in Poland too.
Now, Poland has a unique feature within its constitution that limits debt to a rate of 55% of GDP. Is that something that could perhaps be translated to the Eurozone countries in order to prevent such ballooning debt cases in the future?
Yes, Poland has, I think the best part of Polish constitution is the debt brake, which says that public debt to GDP ratio cannot exceed 60%. And this was constitution was passed in 1997. And it has this part of Poland's constitution, the debt brake, has served as well in a sense that we probably most likely would have much higher debt to GDP, public debt, without that. Poland, to my knowledge, was the first country in Europe to have such a debt brake. So we should derive some satisfaction that other countries follow, including Germany. They have a little more formulas, not so simple. But in this respect, that's true, that Poland has been a pioneer.
Recently, EU finance ministers adopted a short-selling law that includes an optional ban on naked credit default swaps tied to sovereign debt. This follows bans on short selling of bank stocks in the fall and summer of 2011. Now, what do you make of this type of government intervention in the markets?
Well, I don't think that this sort of bans can substitute for serious reforms. If the markets lose confidence in a given country because creditors come to the conclusion that public debt is too high and there are no sufficient reforms in sight, then no bans can prevent the markets. And when the markets to show that they lose confidence, and it should be remembered that the markets are not only hedge funds, which are disliked by many politicians. The markets are first of all the pension funds, which gather savings of millions and millions of ordinary people. So if the governments are not disciplined and they issue lots of debt which is bought by, say, pension funds, ordinary people suffer. And no amount of bans can substitute for reforms. And if the governments launch really comprehensive reforms, then confidence can return. That, for example, in our region of Europe, the Baltic countries and Bulgaria were in a very serious trouble in 2009, and the economies collapsed because they allowed the credit boom to develop. And these very brave countries responded with a wave of radical reforms. And the yields on their bonds, which initially jumped to very high levels, have collapsed. So no bans can substitute for reforms.
Despite across-the-board cuts in debt ratings of many Eurozone nations by S&P, Standard & Poor's, borrowing costs for countries like Spain and Italy are dropping. Now, some speculate that this is because the EU is prepared to step in and provide liquidity through the LTRO program. Now, is LTRO a piece of plaster tape covering up a deep wound, or is this the medicine that will cure the current sickness?
No money creation by ECB can solve the problems of Italy and Spain. It is up to these countries to remove the sources of the economic weaknesses, which means more fiscal consolidation, more reforms on the spending side, deregulation, especially of labor market. And I find it encouraging that the new governments in Italy and Spain started these policies. And this contributed, I think, to the fact that yields has declined. Of course, this is not the only reason. This, what was mentioned, the injection of liquidity by ECB may be another factor, but in a bit longer run, it is better policies which are the only good solution.
Does the way back to prosperity lie in the raising of interest rates and allowing insolvent banks and financial institutions to fail?
Certainly, prolonging very lax monetary policy in the it's a risky business, as Japan has shown. The Japanese central bank has been conducting very easy monetary policy, and Japan is still growing very, very slowly. And there is a lot of research which shows that with very low interest rates, which are kept for a longer time, there are no incentives for the bank to restructure and for the bank's client to restructure either. So I think what is being done by Federal Reserve Board in the United States and by Bank of England or Bank of Japan is not a free lunch.
Let's imagine today you're in a position of power. What are some of the first steps you would take to fix this problem?
Well, with respect to Poland, fortunately, we are not facing a grave risk of Greek-type fiscal crisis, mostly because we have a debt break in the constitution. But we are facing a risk of a slowdown in the longer economic growth, because employment may fall if retirement age is not postponed, investment ratio is not high enough, productivity would more depend on Poland's universities. So we need, in order to avoid this gradual slowdown in Poland's rate of growth, we need more reforms too. In the case of Eurozone countries which are in grave trouble, I don't see any good substitute for better policies of the governments of these countries. No, there is not enough bailout which will save Italy. Not enough. There would be, even if such a bailout would be forthcoming, it would not solve the Italian problems. So instead of encouraging the European Union, European Central Bank to increase the bailout funds, I think one should rather focus on the government, on what the governments in problem countries are doing, and encourage them to do what is good for them and which is also good for the Eurozone as a whole.
In order for there to be a boom, there has to be a bust. Now, is today's economic model, the Keynesian model, leading us in the wrong direction? Is it perhaps the time of the Austrian school to step up?
Well, I already mentioned that I have serious misgivings regarding the policies of very low interest rates which are kept for a longer time, not just a couple of months after the bubble has burst, but for years and years, because with the passage of time, the cost would increase. And we even now see that the very low interest rates introduced and kept by Federal Reserve Board are contributing to asset bubbles in the world, including oil prices. They fuel asset bubbles in China because Chinese currency is linked to a dollar. So there are risks with these policies. Also, massive quantitative easing, which expands the balance sheet of central banks, creates problems of exit from this policy. And I don't think it's only the technical problem, like many economists are saying. It's a political problem, because this would require that securities, massive securities which are bought by central banks are sold, and this can affect their prices in such a way, in a negative way. And banks which engage in massive money creation to buy various securities, I think, risk politicization. So there may be pressure from the politician not to do that. Do not exit, or exit slowly, or postpone the day of reckoning. So even if there are some short-term benefits, there are also longer-term costs. And with the passage of time, these costs may outweigh the benefits.
In your opinion, then, it would be better to go through some short-term pain rather than prolong the issues that we're going through right now. So something akin to the Balcerowicz Plan, an incredible shock that would move the system away from the current levels of debt.
Well, Polish conditions in 1989 were different from the conditions which prevail now in the Eurozone. Yeah, I think that Poland's economic situation was much more serious, difficult than even the one in Greece. But political situation was better because most Poles realized that problems were due to a bad system and they were not resisting the change of the system. While in Greece, many people still, from what I know, do not realize that. Whether it's better to have initially, whether it's better to have more radical reform which then bring about quicker recovery or to prolong, that's an empirical question. On the whole, I would be for measures which may be painful in the short run, but bring about quicker and lasting recovery in the longer run. But one has to analyze various interventions piece by piece. In the case of central banks, I think it was very difficult to avoid the initial injection of liquidity in the banking system in order to avoid collapse. What I am skeptical about are next interventions and maintaining very low interest rates in the longer run, because I am afraid it would hurt the economy, and I think it is not an accident that American recovery so far has been very slow.
Professor Balcerowicz, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.